Hello, good morning. I'm truly honored to share this stage with such distinguished speakers today for a discussion on effective strategies for border collaboration and border management. I'm going to go through the names of the panelists, of these panelists, and their titles. We have Jason Marczak, Vice President and Senior Director of the Atlantic Council's Adrienne Arsht Latin America Center. Thank you so much, Jason, for being here.
Thank you, Mayra.
Jerónimo Gutiérrez, former ambassador of Mexico and senior advisor of Covington and Burling. Thank you so much for being here. Oscar del Cueto Cuevas, President and Executive Representative of CPKC Mexico. Thank you for being here.
Thank you, Mayra.
And John Cowan Jr., Mayor of the City of Brownsville. Thank you so much for being here. And I'm going to start this discussion by saying that in 2023, Mexico became the top trading partner to the US with roughly $800 billion. First question for Jerónimo. Why is trade important? It's a trade 101 question, right? Let's go from there.
So Mexico is one of the most trade-intensive countries, much more than the United States and actually in Canada. So, but in general, I would say that it's difficult to conceive for any open economy nowadays, and a successful strategy development and economic development strategy without trade. And I would add that in the case of Mexico in particular, it helps our trade relations, I think, have helped anchor reforms, a lot of reforms on the domestic front also. So our trade relationship in the context of North America, as you know, Mexico is one of the countries with the largest number of trade agreements. We have, I think, trade agreements with over 40 countries. We essentially trade with everybody. But that has been a very important part of actually, I think, anchoring domestic reforms in different fronts. And if you look at at some of the debates that are actually going on right now, in the domestic policy debates in Mexico, they are I would make the case that it is precisely because of our trade relations that we're able to keep some important policies in place. So that would be my short answer.
Thank you so much. I live on the border. I live in El Paso, Texas, and woo. When I listen to these trade numbers, I rarely hear about the significance of borders. So borders, ports of entry, are at the crossroads of trade facilitation and trade efficiency, meaning that border infrastructure is also key for trade facilitation. And my next question to you again, Jerónimo, is how do you find the current state of infrastructure at the border for trade facilitation and trade efficiency?
Quickly, I think it's improved a lot over the last, I would say, 15 years. I would say that even in spite of that, it's obsolete. I think that if, you'll hear stories which are true about 6 to 8 hours of waiting time by trucks, whether on Laredo or in other ports of entry, that is that has a very heavy burden on the cost of firms and their trade. So people at the border often say that we think about our port of entry infrastructure, one time, and by the time we build it, it has become essentially obsolete. It takes a lot of time. I think that we have to reconceive the border infrastructure of the 21st century. I think the 21st century port of entry is something quite different than the ones we had during the last century. I think that, and involves many of things that Oscar and all of you know, pre-clearance areas for business, even hotels. I mean, we have to have a completely different concept of the port of entry. And I would say, just to we're writing as part of the work of the U.S.-Mexico Foundation, where I sometimes help them as a fellow. We're writing a piece on, I think the next step is actually to do a joint or a binational customs authority. I think that's the next step and obviously along with our Canadian friends. Why? Because there's not a single place in which you have two very important aspects of the relationship that are manifested there. One is drug trafficking, and specifically fentanyl. It's a customs issue. And the way to address it is, I think, taking that step to really have a binational customs authority. I know people, I've raised this idea and we're writing about it. People tell me you're crazy, that's never going to happen. That's what people said about our X cross in Tijuana, right, where we now have, and many other infrastructure. I think it should be done. And the other one is precisely because that way we can really plan much better our ports, our land ports, from a regional perspective, our ports of entry along the border, and hopefully along with our Canadian friends. And I think that the model that can be, used as a reference is what we do on water at the border. We have the 1944 treaty by which we manage our joint water basins. And that created an international organization, which is the IBWC, which has two sections, the Mexican section and the US section, which depend on the State Department and SRE. And I think something similar should be done for customs. And there's already a lot of customs cooperation. I mean, we have preclearance, we have all the FAST programs, etc. But I think that's the natural step in terms of border cooperation and management.
Thank you so much. And Jason, my next question is for you. What do you think are the major improvements that are needed at the border?
Well, thank you, Mayra. And I also wanted to thank you and UTEP and all our UTEP friends here. It's great for us and my colleague Maria Fernando's here to be organizing this panel with UTEP. We really enjoy the partnership that we've had for quite some time together, and always great to be on a panel with Jeronimo, Oscar, Mayor Cohen. Great to all be together here. I also like to speak after Jeronimo because then I can just say I agree and have a very short answer. But I think what's needed to actually, many of us are probably Eagles fans. Not the Philadelphia Eagles, but the Eagles that wrote saying Life in the Fast Lane. And so really the question is, how do we actually make the border become the fast lane? And how do we improve some of those economic efficiencies? And I think it goes to a number of things, and a lot of work actually that we've done together with you, Mayra, at UTEP, is the importance of improving wait times, reducing those wait times. Jeronimo talked about those, and we've done work together that actually quantifies the economic benefits both for the U.S. and for Mexico on just a 10-minute reduction and what those wait times could look like, both on the economic side, but also on just jobs that are created. Nearly 19,000 jobs directly and indirectly that could be created in Mexico just by reducing the wait time by 10 minutes. And as Jeronimo said, the wait time is oftentimes can be longer than 10 minutes. So you just multiply that number out to see what the impact could be. And also the impact for the U.S., $312 million annually that could be added to the U.S. economy. But what's needed, I agree with, as I said, many of the points that Jeronimo made, but infrastructure is absolutely essential. Technology is essential. Further collaboration between U.S. and Mexican authorities. Further collaboration between ports of entry management and customs authorities. And I think it's also about thinking about the border in a slightly different way, right? The border, we oftentimes think about it as a line, right? The border needs to be thought about maybe slightly differently as the border region or the border ecosystem, right? Because a lot of the choke points that you get to at the border come far before you actually hit that port of entry. And so how do we work both at a federal level and a state level to reduce some of those choke points before you even get to the border, I think is absolutely essential. But the infrastructure is important. I think many of you have probably traveled to the border and you've seen that we talk about things like technology and other ways to enhance facilitation. But there's also the reality of potholes in lanes and getting GSA to fix those potholes, right? So there's the very real physical infrastructure needs that are oftentimes seen, but also the technological things. And how do we have traffic flows to avoid highly congested areas? Working with those engineers, traffic engineers, to have that greater efficiency. So that goes to thinking about the border as this broader ecosystem, this broader border region, as well as the efficiencies of the border itself.
Thank you, Jason. We have a report that we worked with Colegio La Frontera Norte and with the Latin America Center that Jason leads, and the Hunt Institute at the University of Texas El Paso is on our website, and the impact of a 10-minute reduction in border wait times to the US economy and to the Mexican economy. Now, speaking about infrastructure, Oscar, you also lead the rail. It is the first railroad line in North America that crosses Canada, the US, and Mexico, right? It opened up in April of this year. I would like you to let us know how that interconnectedness is important for trade. And I also would like you to talk about the Laredo port of entry. I know that we have one-way rail line in Laredo, and it's another line under construction so that it's going to be a two-way track. How did you advocate for that? And it may have been you, the local government, the state government, in order to create that.
Yeah, thank you, Mayra, and thank you for the invitation, and very glad to share this panel with some experts like Jerónimo and John, the mayor of Matamoros. The reality right now in Laredo is that we are building the second bridge, the railroad bridge in this very important border, which is the most important border for trade between Nuevo Laredo and Laredo. We are constructing there. The second bridge is like a high-speed line that is going to be for the interchange with Union Pacific and us, CPKC, there in Laredo. The most important part on this is to create and reduce time. We were talking about 10 minutes. Here we were talking about 6 hours. The traffic in rail is different. We were moving freight going north, and if they don't reach this window, we have windows every 6 hours. In general, now we have some support from customs to reduce that time and open maybe the window before. But in general, it's 6 hours north, 6 hours south. And if the freight don't reach this window, then they need to wait 6 hours to cross, even though going north or going south. Before we start with the construction, which is going to be a $120 million investment there in Laredo, we were working closely with the CBP and the customs in Mexico to create one of the most important achievements that we have is international cruise. International cruise is now our employees, Mexican employees, moving the trains, crossing the border, not stopping in the middle of the bridge. Before that, we were stopping the train going north, then the crew from Mexico is going back to Mexico walking, and then the crew from the US was coming to pick up the train and moving the train to the north. Now we have this international cruise that is reducing, we identified 30 minutes just per train, reducing the traffic, the time, the dwelling time just to crossing. We have another achievement there in the border. We have now the CBP and customs. They're working together in one location in the US side. Now they are seeing the screens and seeing the trains passing through in the same location. With that, we reduce another time. But with the bridge that we are building, we are expecting to have a reduction for at least 12 hours per day in all the traffic going north or coming south. Why we have this, as you know, the authorization came from the presidential, in the US is a presidential authorization to build another bridge. For the process just to start the construction, we need to obtain 140 permits just to build the bridge in the border, which is water, which is local, federal, state, in both sides of the border. But at the end, we are expecting to have this bridge done by the end of this year, early next year. And the idea is to create this capacity to do the interchange between Mexico and the US. But the most important, I totally agree with Jerónimo, we need to identify how we can work together, both authorities, Mexico and the US, as is happening in Canada. We need to have that in Mexico and the US.
Quick question for you, Oscar. How did that conversation initiate? Where did that conversation initiate?
The acquisition of the
For the
company?
bridge.
For the bridge. Actually, one of the analyses, as many universities and local institutes, they saw the growth for the business between Mexico and the US. Most of the traffic that we are moving is manufacturing. Some of those are material that is going to be used in both sides of the border. And the potential of the growth there in Laredo. Laredo is the most important point for traffic between the US and Mexico, not only for rail, but also for truck. We were expecting to have some capacity constraint in the next coming 3 years. That's why we decided to build this second bridge that is going to give us the capacity. Right now, we are crossing trains between 28 to 32 trains per day in that point in both directions. And the capacity is going to be for 70 to 74 trains per day that we can move. And just to give you one idea, one train that we say is equivalent to 300 trailers that we're going to put out of the highways just with one train. If we multiply that for 70 to 72 trains per day, imagine how many trucks we can move out of the highways in both sides of the border.
And I'll get back to you on that environmental impact, but I'm going to turn the attention to you, John. I know that Brownsville has 6 modes of transportation. If you'd like to talk more about that, and I know that the population of Brownsville is around 200,000. So how is trade impacting the community? And there are under construction several new highways. So what are you doing to facilitate the trade and also to create a smart city in Brownsville?
Sure. So thank you. As you said, Brownsville's about 200,000 people in a region that has about 1.5 million in the Rio Grande Valley. On the Mexican side, right across the river, that's another 2 million people. Over the next 25 years, that region's supposed to double in population, right? And we're already having traffic issues now. Imagine what it's going to look like in 5-10 years from now. And so we're really trying to accelerate the growth in our transportation infrastructure. Fortunately, this year, the Biden administration, it was a bipartisan effort to approve 3 additional presidential permits for new international bridges in Texas. Texas has 28 bridges, and now we're going to add 3 more, and 1 will be in Brownsville. Another one's going to be in Laredo, which will help them as well. And also another, really important project is the deepening of our channel at the Port of Brownsville. Port of Brownsville is the largest land-owning port in the United States, over 40,000 acres. It really serves as northern Mexico's port. But by going from 42 feet depth to 52 feet, they can bring in way more goods and obviously have a tremendous economic impact on the region. That's a $300 million project. And the way that got done was a public-private partnership between Rio Grande LNG, which is a new export terminal at the port. It's an $18.4 billion project, the largest energy project right now in the United States. The U.S. Army Corps of Engineers and the Port of Brownsville, they're all chipping in to pay for this. So those are the type of outside-of-the-box, funding mechanisms that we're looking at. But it's an exciting time for us. We also have SpaceX in our backyard. It's the most valuable aerospace company in the world, $210 billion. We want to create this aerospace cluster, but also include northern Mexico as well, right? We want the region to grow with all this additional investment. So we can't do that without transportation infrastructure.
Thanks so much, John. And one of the things that resonates is, yes, border infrastructure is one piece, but also policies, right? And in terms of policies, Jason, what policy measures are needed to align border operations with the demands of our liberalized trade environment?
Well, it's a great question, Mayra. I mean, I think insofar as border policies, and we've gotten this a little bit as part of the panel. I think actually what Mayor Cohen was saying, it's really exciting, Mayor, what's happening in Brownsville, right? And I think it's impressive. And also to the number of additional rail traffic as well. But I think when we look at kind of the policies, it's about how do we really facilitate greater cross-border collaboration, right? I mean, that's absolutely essential. And we were talking about kind of the alignment on the U.S. side, and there is alignment, different ports of entry on the Mexican side and the U.S. side, but it's not necessarily consistent across the border. And also there's different standards, right? There's different regulatory standards. There's need for there's different customs procedures. Which can also result in inefficiencies oftentimes in some of the movement of goods. And that cooperation is absolutely fundamental. And one of the things that used to happen, stopped in, I think, 2012, was just getting together the border governors on a regular basis. The U.S.-Mexico Border Governors Conference was a really essential forum for all the 9 border states to come together and think about, well, what are some of the challenges we're having, and how do we really, increase that efficiency? And then, how do we also leverage USMCA better, right? How do we leverage the customs, the trade facilitation provisions within USMCA to reduce some of the costs for the logistics of trade and goods, the shared inspections? I think it's also important to point out, we've been talking about the border and border economic efficiencies and what that can mean. But of course, the narrative and a lot of the concern in the United States is about the border insofar as migration flows and fentanyl flows and other illicit goods. And I'll make the argument that improved economic efficiencies also results in improved security at the border as well, right? And the two very much can go hand in hand, and they're not necessarily one doesn't beget the other, right? And so the more that we can improve the economic flows, the efficiencies at the border, and have greater coordination and collaboration between the U.S. and the Mexican sides, the more that will also have dividends insofar as security enhancements.
Thank you so much. And speaking about security, I'm curious to know about the security on your line, on CPKC, and because that has an impact on where businesses locate, right? There are businesses at the binational level that they are concerned about security. So I wanted you to talk more about that. And also there are emerging technologies that can help facilitate these trade transactions. So if you could please talk a little bit more about that, Oscar.
Sure. Thank you, Mayra. That's, we say that in our network, CPKC, just in Mexico, we have a rate that is 99.98% of the freight that we move arrive without any problems. All the investments about security or cameras that we have, drones that we have, K9s that we have in the border, is helping to move more freight safely and without any problems during the route. We are in Mexico between the borders, Brownsville, one of those, Laredo, going into central Mexico, passing through Monterrey, Saltillo, San Luis, Querétaro, and going to the ports of Veracruz, Tampico, and Lázaro Cárdenas. We have been investing in security for sure. We have a C4 there in Monterrey that is controlling all the access to the freight, but the most important is how we have coordinations with the authority in Mexico. We have a great coordination with Army, with Navy, and the National Guard in Mexico to protect the freight that we are moving by train. We don't have any issues on that. Most of the freight is moving easily without any constraints or problems in security. How we can improve that, which is another point. As more faster we cross any point, is going to be better. We say velocity for train is more safety. And if we have some approvals here in Mexico, as you know, we have the OEA, the Operador Autorizado, Económico Autorizado, and we have the CTPAD in the US. We have many companies that has the certification for CTPAD and the OEA here in Mexico. And the border is crossing like no border line, which is good for all the companies. We need to think in the idea for Jerónimo to having one border customs between Mexico and the US, but if we can improve how we are managing all the information technology and all the data that we have from the companies exporting or importing is going to be in benefit for the trade. And if we can improve more technology, we're going to improve trade. By rail, it's easy to do it.
Thank you so much. Yes, it's communication and it's collaboration as well.
Right.
So, Jerónimo, in terms of that communication that is needed between the U.S. and Mexico for an improved border management, what do you see are the challenges for in cross-border collaboration between the U.S. and Mexico?
I think that the border is plagued by three important challenges. Border sort of coordination by national border. One is that it's intergovernmental coordination. There's so many agencies of both sides that intervene at the border, and that you multiply then by 2 as you make it bilateral. So a lot of agencies, including state or local agencies, have a saying and have a vested interest and operate in the border. And that coordinating that big number of agencies, obviously there's some that are much more important, whether it's CBP and Aduanas or now ANAM. I mean, they're clearly ones that have a heavier weight. But the first challenge is, I think, coordinating the different agencies that are involved. And that's a challenge for the private sector also, because they have to deal, if you're building a port of entry, you need to deal, you need to deal with different agencies, you need to deal with different permits. If you're doing trade, it's pretty much the same thing. So that's one. The second one is, I think that the border has been managed for decades based on emergencies. We do something at the border every time there's an emergency. We are not planning constantly on how to have better border management. We do so, or at least we have done so, whether it's on water, migration, drugs, ports of entry. We always wait until there's an emergency. So the border planning has really moved based upon emergencies, and I think that's a different. It's a problem. And then the last one, if you go to the border, people at the border will tell you, just if Washington and Mexico City leave us aside, we'll fix things. And there's some truth to that. Major, you can tell me about that. But people at the border communities are very jealous, and rightly so, of their space, because they say, oh, I'm going to listen to a bureaucrat in Washington or in Mexico City that has never been at a border or probably doesn't, and they're trying to fix our problems here. So that's another challenge. Now, where can we move, I think, and this is something much more, but we have sort of a track to do this and address it from a competitiveness point of view, which is Chapter 26 of the USMCA. Chapter 26 of the United States-Mexico-Canada Agreement is a cooperation chapter that it's there precisely with the purpose of, we have our trade relations, they're important, and you just gave us some numbers, Mayra, about, we're number one and number two trading partners, obviously, of the United States, huge amounts of trade going, but the point is, we need to continue, that chapter is there to cooperate on making a more competitive and resilient region. And within that chapter, I think we should, seriously focus on the borders, and I would go on the north or the perimeter of North America, including our Canadian friends, on the borders. How do we see how do we look at the borders of North America 50 years from now? What are they going to be? And for that, we need to plan how does trade worldwide is going to move. What are our ports and land ports infrastructure is going to be? It's an econometric exercise. Where is the trade going to be? What's going to happen with the Panama Canal? What's going to happen if the Suez Canal? And then, sort of build, this is the type of infrastructure that we need on the coasts, airports, and the border to really become competitive. And then from there, we need to plan that. We don't have it. We don't have that blueprint, not even at the border. What has been done usually, the U.S. is more advanced, is the U.S. has done the famous regional master plans. Texas has its own, 2012, and if I'm not mistaken, 2020 was the last one. But they're good, they're a good exercise. They're largely carried out at state level, and that's the only planning we have. And going again to the land border. And on the Mexican side, we really don't have nothing. We have had exercises to do the border commissions. Remember, hemos tenido comisiones de la frontera, la de Rufo, another that, they're announced with a lot of fanfare, and they go nowhere, right? I think, I don't have the answer. I think that what we need to do is plan for that, then determine what is the border infrastructure that is needed, understanding it as, we need a second wave of pre-clearance between Mexico and the United States. There was one right after 9/11. We need a second, make an assessment of where are we on trade and people pre-clearance, and that needs to be part of the equation. And then we have to decide what are the ports of entry. If you go to the border, everybody at the border wants their port of entry. That's the truth. I mean, because it brings economic activity, and not everybody can have its port of entry. That's the truth. And we need to figure out how do we, again, design the borders, the ports of entry that we have already, The second pre-clearance, we're going to need more and better infrastructure. And it's not going to be all the solution, better infrastructure. It's also going to be how, to your point, Jason, how do we pre-clear as much as possible? And I think, I might have been all over the board here, but that needs to go as a deliberate effort of the countries and the governments in the context of Chapter 26 of USMCA to say, if we want to remain competitive, we need to do a specific effort for this on border infrastructure in the context of the trade.
But I just want to add to your comment that the border, well, I don't believe is a jealousy. I think it is more bringing us to those conversations.
Yeah, exactly.
Given that we live right there, right, and we know how the ecosystem operates, so that's important to bring communities, border communities, to the table. And John, given that you also live on the border and you are the mayor of Brownsville, I would like to know more about how the impact of improved efficiencies on trade is on the economic development of Brownsville in particular.
Yeah, that's a great question. I think, I'm also a U.S. Customs broker, by the way, so I understand all the headaches that are on this room as well. But, I think, we're all trying to go after, nearshoring and, regionalism, right? That's the new trend, right? And I think every 10% of increase in employment on the maquiladora side or the EMEX side, there's a 3 to 4% benefit in Brownsville, right? And so I think that should be our driving factor in how we work together to go to market and to attract companies. But if we don't have that infrastructure to allow for that, a more seamless transfer of goods, we're not going to be as competitive as a region. But it's absolutely crucial to our economy locally. All the goods that transfer back and forth, all the services that happen. I have a business in Matamoros as well. I consider ourselves a community divided by one river, right? And it's, we just have to make sure that we're removing barriers as much as we can in a very safe way.
Thank you so much. And this is an important year for the U.S. and Mexico. There are some political changes. We have a new president on board, Claudia Sheinbaum in Mexico. But also in the horizon, we see that there's a USMCA review in 2026, right? We also have the World Cup that year, by the way. That's important. But I wanted to know, there are some discussions that are in the horizon for the Mexican Congress, in particular about regulatory agencies, like the Federal Telecommunications Agency here in Mexico that may disappear, and other agencies. I know that you, Jason, you have spoken a little bit about that. So what are your thoughts on these upcoming challenges to the USMCA review?
Well, thanks, Mayra. And I think before I answer, I think one other thing just to point out when we look about the importance of the border looking forward is going back to the pandemic and the fact that there was it was real clear there's a lack of essential industry designation in the midst of the pandemic that really we actually haven't addressed it since then. We kind of got past the pandemic, and Jeronimo, your point on being able to look to the future, we need to think about future major events that are going to potentially impact the border and how are we more resilient. But going to USMCA, it's going to be next year's beginning with the review period, absolutely essential. And I think it'll be always happy to leave Washington for a moment and not think about politics and elections and whatnot. But I think USMCA review is also going to be an important point to reaffirm in the United States the importance of Mexico for U.S. jobs. Right, and the importance of the U.S.-Mexico trade brings for direct and indirect jobs in the United States. The number of U.S. cities that benefit from Mexican investment, from trade across the border. I mean, we're talking about border states here, but border traffic has benefits far beyond the border states. And Mexico is the one top first, second, or third trading partner of most states across the country. And so I think it's going to be really important as we enter into this USMCA review period to generally it's the trade naysayers that have a greater voice than those who are in favor and those who see the benefits of trade. And so I think really showing the importance of this economic relationship, especially at a time when there's other narratives on that relationship that tend to dominate. That's going to be absolutely essential. Absolutely essential. And I think that the USMCA has become the gold standard of our trade agreements, and we've seen the increase in commercial flows that have happened as a result, the increase in coordination and collaboration. And I think that will be absolutely, when we have a new Congress that will come in January in the United States, is having those conversations on USMCA, what it means for the United States, and doing so in parallel with our Mexican counterparts, right? I mean, I think that is important in her inaugural address this week that President Sheinbaum mentioned the importance of economic cooperation with the United States and with Canada. It's clear that she sees that relationship as absolutely, it's fundamental for investment in Mexico, and I think we need to continue to build on that momentum.
Thanks so much, Jeronimo. You're next. In terms of the challenges and opportunities that you see for the U.S.
I have to say, and I see Jerry here, Schwebel, who's really Mr. Border. For anybody that doesn't know him, he's really the one that, he's been 50 years building the U.S.-Mexico border. And we were recently at an event in Laredo, and I said something that I truly believe, which is the following. The North American partners, we have never had, I think, honestly, since probably the Second World War, a better opportunity to strengthen our economic partnership and take it a step farther. Because of what everybody talks now, the nearshoring, the geopolitical context, the sort of the China strategic competition, everything that people like us talk in forums like this every single day nowadays. And that's true. But there has never been, in my view, a biggest risk since then also to where the political context in each of the countries can absolutely destroy that opportunity. And I think that's where we are. And we have to be very careful. The domestic context of Mexico, the United States, and to some extent Canada nowadays, are just too polarized, too myopic, and I think with the potential of putting at risk what we have at USMCA and the sort of relation and the opportunity that we have. And that is why I think it's very important to have all stakeholders that believe in the benefits of our trade relation be very actively from now until, we're going to have a bumpy road next year with the review and everything. Be very active so it doesn't, it stays within the rails. If you see that's one point, but if you see the narrative, I mean, I have to say it, but, just a few days, Kamala Harris was making the point about how, she was making the point as part of the campaign of how she voted against USMCA, and she said, and I'm going for more. And on the Mexican side, to your question, we have a very clear narrative, and I think that 100 points that came out of President Sheinbaum just a few days, the narrative is perfect. If you look at, I think it's pretty decent. And it's very refreshing here from the new administration. The past one, we have to build resilience in supply chains, the opportunity of nearshoring. The narrative is perfect. There's a gap between the narrative and the actual actions that we're taking to achieve that. And part of the problem is going to be precisely, to your point, what we end up doing with this constitutional independent. We are poised on at least three fronts: geo-modified corn, energy, rules of origin, that those conflicts are going to drag into the review, and they're going to be difficult. And specifically on the Mexican side, I think we're shooting ourselves in the foot. If we don't solve them, we're going to lose those patents. I have no question about it. And so you have to be consequent with what you're trying to build in terms of this North American great opportunity on the context of nearshoring, and what you actually do domestically to achieve that. And I think there's a gap.
We know that Claudia Sheinbaum is an environmentalist, right? Mm-hmm. And we know that rail has very low carbon dioxide emissions. So I'd like you to be brief on that. What is the future on rail for the binational cooperation? And also, is nearshoring happening? Have you seen anything on that, in particular on commercial crossings?
Sure. Actually, yes, and I think it's a great question. I'm gonna start responding the second part of the question. We see some already some investment in Mexico for nearshoring. Mainly of those are investments that are already here in Mexico, increasing capacity, building more capacity, or another next to door companies, which is examples that we have in San Luis Potosí, Monterrey. For sure, we are seeing some big demand on the industrial parks that is growing mainly in the north part of Mexico. It's not central or south of Mexico, but yes, we are seeing some already nearshoring investment in Mexico. One of the main goals that the investment in Mexico is requesting is infrastructure, capacity to move freight, goods, all the things that they need to have for the growing in Mexico. One of those main topics is obviously water, electricity, gas, all that. But when they are close to the site, where is going to be the location for the new investment, they are asking for rail service. Why rail service? Most of the auto manufacturers here in Mexico, they have or they want to have two companies serving them by rail, because most of the goals that the big companies, global companies has in the future is to reduce the impact of the contamination, the pollution that they are causing into the environmental. One of those is that why the reason is that why they are asking for rail, because we are 75% less impact on the contamination pollution into the moving freight. We are estimating, and if you go to our webpage in CPKC, you can do the math for the impact that we have on the pollution if we move goods from Mexico City into the border, Laredo, as an example. If you decide to move that by truck or by rail, 75% less contamination by rail. That is the future for moving freight. And talking about, as Jerónimo said, we are in a North America region. Now we are the only rail network that connect the three countries. And now we can offer that service. It's not only Claudia Sheinbaum, most of the people in Mexico is going to see how they can do less impact to the environmental in the world, not just in Mexico. We need to think on that, and the rail is the option.
Yeah, climate change is for real.
My final thought is just to defer all the hard questions to my fellow panelists here, to Mayor, Oscar, and Jerónimo. But I think my last thought, and to thank you, Mayra and UTEP, for the great collaboration. But I think what we're talking about here is really a rethinking of how we manage the border, how we think about the border, and I think Jerónimo's excellent points on thinking beyond the crisis of the day and being able to better plan where supply chains are going and how the three countries can work in a more integrated way, looking to especially some of the global challenges that we'll see and the importance of working even more closely on the North American front.
And John, before we turn into questions, speaking about the nearshoring, have you seen an impact of nearshoring in Brownsville recently, in particular after COVID hit?
Well, I think it speaks to the other challenges that we face as a region, being the lack of electrical infrastructure and water infrastructure, right? So on both sides of the river, I think we're facing capacity issues when it comes to electrical distribution. There's a lot of congestion in our area, and I think on the Mexican side as well. So we really need to focus on addressing those systemic issues before we'll see the potential realized in our area.
Thanks so much. One of the questions is about the judiciary reform and how it impacts the USMCA review. Jerónimo, do you have any thoughts?
Well, first, it's a fact now.
It is a fact.
It's done. So I'll try to be as candid as I can while being careful. I'm not thrilled about the reform. Personally, I think it's such a huge change that it naturally implies uncertainty. I think that global firms are concerned about about what that means for their day-to-day operations in Mexico, and I think rightly so. I think Mexican firms are also. I'm not prejudging the result, so I'll be clear about that. I'm a skeptic about it. I think that for good reasons. But I think that what let me put it clearly, what Ambassador Salazar was trying to say when he made his statement, and we went into a pause just a few months ago, was honestly saying we're worried about this, and I think that the debate was a very unuseful debate. That the way it was, I think, presented by former President López Obrador, because he made the point about this is something that the Mexicans should decide by themselves, and obviously yes, this is for the Mexicans to decide. That was not the question. I think the question was whether the reform would do what it attempted to do, and I think that the concern expressed by our U.S. partners was the same that many people express here. We're not sure if that reform is going to achieve what it is intended to achieve. More specifically, I think that on trade, and I think that it's something, it's going to be a side effect, is that a lot of the deals, for many years, Mexico's judiciary had been trying to build a reputation where M&A's deals were going to be subject to Mexican law. And that's going to change again. I think that a consequence is going to be, as people decide to do deals in Mexico, they're probably going to they're going to rely more on New York law, for example. I know that the past administration, at least the president, made very clearly his views that he did not like arbitrations, that he thought that was a legacy of the neoliberal bad people that created the international arbitrations. And I'm being very honest, and I think that's a mistake, because now people are going to probably rely more on arbitration as they do the deals instead of Mexican law. And one final comment is, I think that everybody agrees that the Mexican judiciary should be far better protected from interests and organized crime. There's no question. And there's corruption in it. There is absolutely no question. And I think that the United States is fully interested in support, in having Mexico, in having a judicial reform that achieves that. I think the question is, are we sure that we're going to achieve that with this reform? And I leave it there.
There are other reforms, and Jason asked me to, I'm purposely choosing the most difficult questions for you. So, there's a question that I'm going to address to John and Oscar, which is interesting. Could rail connect Matamoros seaport to the backbone of CPKC, 80 kilometers from Matamoros?
Yeah, actually, we connect to Matamoros. We have the interchange there in Brownsville with the Union Pacific. Union Pacific has connection with us in Matamoros and Brownsville and Nuevo Laredo and Laredo. And Union Pacific has connection with Grupo México Transportes, all the borders in Mexico. But yeah, the most important, and I was talking with John before the panel about the importance of the port of Brownsville to connect with the Mexican economy. Most of the business in Monterrey are going through the port of Brownsville, and that connectivity is helping us to make business. But for sure, with the capacity that we have between Matamoros and Monterrey, is helping us to create more business in the Monterrey area. Nearshoring, as I mentioned, is growing there in Monterrey, and for sure, Grupo México is building a bypass that is going to be around Monterrey, and it's going to be beneficial for us to connect also all the traffic that is coming from the south, central Mexico, going to Brownsville. Is not going to pass through Monterrey exactly. It's going to be around Monterrey, which is going to be more expedite process to reach the border there in Brownsville. And now we are working more to create more capacity in Laredo, as I mentioned, the bridge. But for sure, Brownsville and the economy between Tamaulipas, Nuevo León, and in the area of the Brownsville is growing, and is going to be growing for the next coming years.
Thank you, Oscar. John, this is a question for you. What are the most critical factors for improving effective border management between the U.S. and Mexico, especially in balancing security, trade efficiency, and the flow of goods and people.
We can have all the best infrastructure in the world, but if it's not, we don't have the staffing from U.S. Customs or on the Mexican side, it's not going to matter, right? So I think that issue is something that needs to be addressed right now. And I know they have their challenges with their recruiting and getting agents hired, but I think we have the best plans to go forward, right? But if we don't have the right staffing levels, we'll never be able to take advantage of the infrastructure that we have.
And there's a follow-up question that it says Texas DPS utilizes the secondary inspection as a political tool, which causes a high disruption at the border to leverage the negotiations with DC. How do you think this situation could be addressed?
Well, I think that's a very serious topic for me. I think it basically stopped trade in our city for whenever the governor decides to implement those inspections, and those inspections did not result in any seizures or significant issues, right? So I think it's just a political tool that he's using, and has a detrimental impact on our city and also the Texas and national economy. So I think I voiced that to the governor and his staff, and I think it just takes a regional approach to make sure that our voices are heard.
Thank you so much. And last question for Jerónimo before we say our final thoughts. It says here, not only infrastructure is obsolete, but the current one is not being used to its full capacity. As Jerónimo mentioned, the need for a binational authority that would ensure that the infrastructure is used to its full potential. How do we make this happen?
Well, I think that the problem, we do have overstressed and underused infrastructure along the border. And that's clear. And I think that's partly the result of the fact that we did not coordinate enough in planning that infrastructure. And there are, stories, actually true stories, how we, some of the ports of entry, let me say something that is quite harsh, but some of the port of entry that exist today might, most probably should have not existed initially. And that's, but there's interest in getting them done, and they got the permit, and they started to build, and they built it. And I don't want to get into the weeds of that, but I think that's the problem. We did not do well enough planning to make sure that the border infrastructure we have was actually going to be, and it's always difficult because infrastructure is lumpy, so you cannot build. You have to put a lot of money into building a port of entry, and it's likely going to be, when you start it, it's going to be underused because it's not so easy to build it gradually, right? But I think that's largely a problem of planning that, and now that's why I think we should have a decent, we have 50 plus border crossings.
Yes.
We should sort of try to get a minimum share assessment of where they are, what's going to happen with them in the future, which ones need to be modernized, expanded, can be expanded or not, based upon what we believe are going to be the regional tendencies of our trade relationship. And then just come, I believe that Canada and the US have a 5-year program, actually planning. We don't, which is crazy. So that is why we've got also stories when the US built, where the US, we have had instances in which the US moved much quicker to get the port of entry ready, and you have on the US side a port of entry that leads to nowhere on the Mexican side, and vice versa. That has happened. The bridge at the middle of the river. And I think that's I think that resulted out of the problem of this problem of planning. If we're able to tackle that based on what we already have, the permits, other permits that have been requested to build additional infrastructure, we could probably, it's not going to be perfect, but we can probably get a better sense of how not to have that sometimes very overused infrastructure, and sometimes very underused infrastructure. And the other thing is, we should have, the Mexico and the US should have a memorandum, at least a memorandum of understanding, meaning at least a intergovernmental type of agreement, not a treaty, by which we describe clearly what the process on each side is to build, design, build, operate ports of entry, and they should communicate and be as homogeneous. They're not. They will never be perfectly homogeneous process because we have, it's different. But I think if we do that, we can do a little bit better of a job in whatever infrastructure we put into the future.
With final thoughts.
I guess, I'm thankful to be on this panel with these esteemed professionals here, and I'm very hopeful for the future. I think coming from a limited government experience, infrastructure projects take a long time to fulfill. A new bridge takes 15, 20 years to implement, right? And I think we have all this growth happening right now. I think we need to find a way to streamline and speed up the improvements that we need to make. Otherwise, we are going to miss out on opportunities. So we just need to work together. I think that's the message, right? We need to increase collaboration and be more unified as we move forward.
Thank you so much, John. Oscar.
I think 2 points. One of them is better coordination. I think that we can improve the coordination between both countries there in the border. We can improve exchanging information, how we can do business in the border, not just for rail, it's for trucks, for people, for everything that we cross in the border. The other one is technology. Not all is investment in new infrastructure. We can improve, or we must to improve technology, how we can share information in advance to crossing some products, how we can control the product that is coming into Mexico or exporting into the US. Is just better information that we can have with technology. We have some readers that are taking the number of the car, sending the information to the border in advance, maybe 200 kilometers in advance to the border, and then we can see if that merchandise or goods is going to cross without any stopping. We need to do that in both directions. We have right now a plan for having a certification for the mechanical people in Mexico, and they will inspect the cars that are going to the US and avoid the inspection that we are now currently having in the US, which is just certifying the people that is doing that inspection in Mexico, in the US, and then we can reduce the time of dwelling those cars, that products, into the border for a second inspection, which is not needed. We can do that in the border in general. Better coordination, better technology, better communication.
Please raise your voice. Oscar, thank you so much. Jeronimo, last thoughts.
But very quickly, when 35 years ago, when people started to talk about the binational airport in the Tijuana, Santiago region, which ended up being the cross-border that we have now, people at that time on both sides would say it's never going to happen. And sure enough, 30 years later, we have it. And it works, and it's fine, and it's financially viable. I think that it's difficult, but we should move to have either a binational or trinational customs authority that allow us to do better processes, custom processes along our borders, plan better the infrastructure that we have, and help us work better on addressing the shared security concern. And it's going to take time. People are going to say that it's crazy, that will never happen, that's a loss of sovereignty, blah, 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 blah. We should do it.
Thank you so much, Jeronimo. Thank you so much for your time. As I wrap up, I just want to say that...
Thank you, Mayra.
Today we learned that trade is significant for the prosperity of North America, that borders are at the intersection of trade facilitation and trade efficiency. Think more about the borders, how we can strategize their interconnectedness, and be that voice for our border communities and for North America. Thank you so much.